The planet Kira 7 was a world of eternal winter. Snow fell every day without stopping. Ice covered everything as far as any eye could see. The mountains were white. The valleys were white. Even the sky seemed white most of the time, heavy with clouds that never emptied completely. But this frozen world was not empty. It was home to the Velthari dragons. They were beautiful and terrible creatures. Their scales shimmered like blue gemstones, catching the little light that broke through the clouds and reflecting it in patterns that danced across the snow. They were massive, each adult dragon as large as the human buildings called houses. Their wings could block out the sun when they flew overhead. Their breath was not fire like the dragons of human legends, but frost. They could freeze a river solid with a single exhale. For 10,000 generations, they had ruled this world. They had no enemies, no predators. Nothing on Kira 7 could challenge them. They lived in family groups called packs, and they raised their young in caves carved deep into the mountains, where the ice was thick and the cold was perfect for their eggs. But now, for the first time in their long history, the Velthari were afraid. Matriarch Selvora stood in the great nesting cavern, her body trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She was the leader of her pack, the oldest and wisest among them. She had lived for 400 years. She had seen storms that lasted decades. She had watched glaciers form and break apart. She had survived everything this harsh world could throw at her, but she could not survive this. Before her lay 17 eggs. They rested in nests made of packed snow and shed scales, carefully arranged to keep them at the perfect temperature. Each egg was the size of a small boulder, and their shells were not like the eggs of other creatures. They were crystalline, almost transparent, and they glowed with a soft inner light. That light was the life force of the hatchlings inside, and that light was fading. Selvora pressed her great snout against one of the eggs, the one that held her firstborn daughter. Through the crystal shell, she could see the tiny form curled inside. So small, so helpless, so sick. They grow weaker, she said, her voice echoing through the cavern like distant thunder. I can feel their lights dimming. Behind her, Kethoran shifted his weight from one massive leg to another. He was her mate, the father of these eggs, and his grief was just as deep as hers. But he was also practical, and he had spent the day speaking with the healers. 3 more will be lost by dawn, he said. The healers have tried everything. The old medicines, the sacred chants, the warmth rituals. Nothing works. This sickness is not like anything we have faced before. Selvora closed her eyes. 3 more. They had already lost 5 from this clutch. 5 lives that never got to begin. 5 children she would never teach to fly. 5 voices that would never join the pack's song. She turned to look at her mate, and in her ancient eyes there was a despair that made him look away. What kind of plague is this? She asked. It came from nowhere. It strikes without warning. It kills our unborn, but leaves us untouched. What cruel force would create such a thing? Kethoran had no answer. None of them did dot around them. The rest of the pack had gathered. 47 dragons in all, representing 3 generations of the same bloodline. They stood in silence along the walls of the cavern, their scales catching the dim light from the dying eggs. Some of them had already lost clutches of their own this season. Others were watching their eggs fade, just as Selvora was watching hers. 12 clutches. Nearly 200 eggs. And more than half were already gone. The pack healer, an elderly female named Verthini, stepped forward. Her scales had faded with age from bright blue to pale gray, and her movements were slow and careful. She had been healing sick dragons for 300 years, but she had never felt so helpless. I have examined the eggs again, she said, her voice tired and sad. The sickness is not in their bodies. It is in their essence. Something is poisoning the very force that gives them life. I do not know what it is. I do not know where it came from. And I do not know how to stop it. A young male named Kethos, barely 50 years old and still hot-headed, slammed his tail against the ground. The impact shook loose a shower of ice from the ceiling. Then we find where it came from, he growled. We hunt it down. We destroy it. How? Verthini replied gently. Can you hunt a shadow? Can you destroy wind? This plague has no form, no body, no heart to stop. It simply is. Then we leave, another dragon suggested. We fly to another land. We find a place where the sickness has not reached. Selvora shook her head. The scouts have returned from every direction. The sickness is everywhere. Every pack they found is suffering the same fate. There is nowhere to run. Silence fell over the cavern again. The only sound was the soft, steady breathing of 47 dragons and the barely audible pulse of the dying eggs. Selvora raised her head toward the ceiling of the cavern, toward the stone that separated them from the sky and the stars and whatever cruel universe had sent this plague to destroy them. And she began to sing Dot. It was a morning song, one that had not been sung in 1,000 years. It was the song the dragons sang when all hope was lost, when there was nothing left to do but grieve. Her voice rose and fell in patterns that humans would find haunting and strange. It had no words, only sounds that carried the weight of her sorrow, her fear, her love for the children she was losing. One by one, the other dragons joined her. Ketharn added his deep rumble to her melody. Verthini's aged voice wove through the harmony. Even young Kethos, despite his anger, could not resist the pull of the ancient song. 40-7 voices rose together, filling the cavern, echoing up through the mountain, bursting out into the eternal blizzard above Dot and across the frozen wastes of Kirith 7. Other packs heard the song and understood. They added their own voices. Mountains away, the mourning spread from pack to pack until the entire continent was singing Dot. It was the sound of a species saying goodbye to its future. None of them noticed the streak of fire that cut across the sky that night. None of them saw the small vessel fighting against the wind and snow as it descended toward the surface. None of them knew that somewhere in that vast wide emptiness, something new had arrived. Something small, something fragile, something that would change everything. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, there was only the song and the snow and the slow dimming of lights that should have burned bright for centuries. For 3 days, Caroline did not sleep. She set up her portable laboratory beside the dying eggs, spreading her equipment across the frozen floor in a pattern that made sense only to her. The dragons watched every movement she made, trying to understand the strange devices and glowing screens that seemed so primitive compared to their own ancient wisdom, yet clearly held knowledge they did not possess. The first step was diagnosis. Caroline attached tiny sensors to each of the 17 eggs, reading the life signs of the hatchlings inside. The data confirmed what she had feared. The blight had taken hold deeply. The hatchlings were fading, their life essence being slowly drained away by the invisible pathogen. How long do they have? Selvora asked, standing close enough that her breath created frost patterns on Caroline's equipment. Without treatment, maybe 3 more days for the weakest ones. A week for the strongest. Caroline kept her voice steady, even though her heart ached at the words. The treatment needs to work quickly. She prepared the first dose carefully. The compound was a complex mixture of organic molecules and synthetic proteins, designed to bond with the blight pathogen and neutralize its ability to drain life essence. In laboratory conditions, it had shown promising results. In the field, under the pressure of a dying species watching her every move, she could only hope it would perform the same way. The injection process required precision. Each egg had a Wisman van natural weak point in its crystalline shell, a place where nutrients from the outside could pass through to the hatchling inside. Caroline had to locate these points by touch and instrument, then deliver exactly the right amount of compound without damaging the delicate shell. The first injection took 2 hours. By the time she was ready for the second egg, her hands were shaking from exhaustion and stress. But she forced herself to continue. The dragons were depending on her. The hatchlings were depending on her. Henry would have expected nothing less. On the second day, the pack's dynamics began to change. At first, the dragons had watched her with suspicion, keeping their distance, ready to strike if she made any move that seemed threatening. But as the hours passed and she worked without rest, without complaint, without asking for anything in return, something shifted. Young Kethos, the hot-headed male who had wanted to hunt the plague, was the first to approach her directly. "You need water," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Humans require water to function. I will bring you some." Before Caroline could respond, he was gone, returning minutes later with a chunk of ice that had been carefully melted in his frostfire breath. The resulting water was cold enough to make her teeth ache, but it was clean and pure. "Thank you," she said, genuinely surprised. Kethos nodded stiffly and retreated to his place along the wall. But Caroline noticed that his posture had changed. He was no longer watching her like a predator watching prey. He was watching her like a guard protecting something valuable. Other dragons followed his example. Verthini, the old healer, began sitting beside Caroline and asking questions about human medicine. She seemed fascinated by the idea that such tiny creatures could develop treatments for diseases that even the ancient Velfari wisdom could not touch. Cathoran brought Caroline food, strange blue plants that grew somewhere deeper in the caves. They tasted like nothing she had ever eaten, cold and slightly sweet, but they provided energy and nutrition. Selvora never left the nesting area. She watched every injection, every sensor reading, every small adjustment that Caroline made. And sometimes, when Caroline looked up from her work, she caught the matriarch looking at her with something that might have been respect. On the second night, disaster almost struck. Caroline was injecting the 14th egg when her hands finally betrayed her. She had been awake for over 50 hours. Her vision was blurring. Her muscles were cramping. And as she pushed the needle into the delicate weak point of the shell, her hand slipped. The needle scratched the surface of the crystalline shell, creating a tiny crack. Caroline's heart stopped. "No, no, no," she whispered, immediately pulling back. "No, please, no." The crack was spreading. Slowly, but visibly, it was growing across the surface of the egg. The glow inside flickered, weakened, then flickered again. Every dragon in the cavern was on their feet, a collective gasp echoing off the walls. Selvora moved forward, her eyes fixed on the damaged egg. "What have you done?" Cathoran demanded, his voice thundering through the space. "It is too early," Caroline said, her voice breaking. "The hatchling is not ready. If the egg breaks now, it will not survive." But even as she spoke, she was moving. Her exhausted brain was racing through everything she knew about the treatment. About dragon physiology, about the desperate science she had developed across years of failure and loss. She grabbed another vial from her kit, a concentrated dose. Dangerous in normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. "This might kill the hatchling," she said, already preparing the injection. "But if I do nothing, the hatchling will definitely die. I have to try." "Do it," Selvora said immediately. Caroline injected the concentrated compound directly through the crack in the shell. She could see the hatchling inside now, a tiny form no bigger than a human child, its scales still soft and pale. It twitched when the compound entered its system, and then the crack stopped spreading. The glow inside the egg, instead of fading, began to pulse stronger. The tiny form inside moved, stretching, flexing muscles that had been weak moments before. The shell cracked again, and again, and suddenly a small head was pushing through the opening. The hatchling was emerging. 2 days early, with compounds still flowing through its system. It should have been impossible. The tiny dragon took its first breath and released a cry. It was high and thin and beautiful, the sound of a life beginning against all odds. The cavern erupted. Dragons roared and sang and wept. Cathoran pressed his great head against the broken shell, tears freezing on his scales. Salvora made a sound that Caroline had never heard before, a rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her ancient soul. The hatchling looked around with eyes that were too new to focus properly. It did not understand why all these giants were making so much noise. It only knew that it was cold and hungry and very confused. Rethini rushed forward to examine the newborn. Her old eyes were wide with amazement. "It is healthy," she announced, her voice cracking with emotion. "The hatchling is healthy. The sickness is gone from its body." Caroline collapsed against one of the other eggs, her legs finally giving out. She was laughing and crying at the same time, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. "It worked," she whispered. "Henry, it worked." But there was no time to rest. Around her, the other eggs were changing. The compound she had injected was taking effect. The glows inside the shells were growing brighter. The hatchlings were moving more, gaining strength. Over the next several hours, 5 more eggs cracked open. 5 more healthy hatchlings entered the world, crying and confused and wonderfully alive. Not all of them survived. Despite everything Caroline did, despite the treatment and the concentrated doses and the desperate measures, 6 of the 17 eggs went dark. 6 hatchlings who had been too far gone to save. Caroline wept for each one. But when the long night finally ended, 11 newborn dragons were nestled together in the warmest part of the cavern, sleeping peacefully while their parents watched over them with joy that had no words. 11 lives. 11 miracles. It was not everyone, but it was enough. Carolyn Walsh had seen many strange worlds during her 15 years as a xenobiologist. She had walked on planets where the trees grew upside down with their roots in the clouds. She had studied creatures that lived in lakes of liquid metal. She had spent months on moons so dark that she had to grow used to seeing only through her instruments. But nothing had prepared her for KY Wrath-7. The cold was beyond anything she had experienced. Even inside her advanced thermal suit, which was supposed to keep her comfortable in any environment, she could feel the chill trying to reach her bones. The wind screamed around her like a living thing, throwing snow into her face shield so thick that she could barely see her own hands in front of her. She pushed forward. One step at a time, her ship had landed 3 miles back, in a small valley that offered some protection from the worst of the wind. The vessel was damaged but functional. It would fly again when she was ready to leave. But first, she had to find the crashed survey probe that had sent the distress signal. That probe had been part of a larger mission to map unexplored worlds on the edge of known space. When it had stopped transmitting, Caroline had been the closest researcher. Finding crashed equipment was not usually her job, but she was curious. The probe's last transmission had included strange readings that she could not explain. Now, as she struggled through the blizzard, her own instruments were showing her things that made the probe's data seem ordinary by comparison. She stopped walking and looked at her scanner again, wiping snow from the display. Massive life signs. The screen showed dozens of them, clustered together in what appeared to be a cave system in the mountain ahead. Each signature was larger than any animal she had ever documented. Whatever lived in those caves was enormous. But that was not what made her heart beat faster. There was another reading. a biochemical signature in the atmosphere. Traces of something that Caroline knew all too well: the stellar blight. She stood frozen for a moment, and the cold had nothing to do with it. The stellar blight was the reason Caroline had left Earth and spent the last 7 years on the frontier of space. It was a plague unlike any other, a pathogen that traveled on solar winds and devastated ecosystems across the galaxy. It attacked the life essence of creatures in ways that normal medicine could not treat. It killed slowly and painfully, and it seemed to target the young more than the old. She had watched 3 worlds fall to this disease. Entire species had gone extinct before her eyes. Forests had turned to dust. Oceans had become graveyards, and she had spent years developing a treatment. Caroline pulled out a small device from her pack and checked its readings. The treatment compound was still stable, still viable despite the cold. She had brought it with her everywhere she went, just in case. The Galactic Medical Council had refused to approve it for wide use. They said it needed more testing, more trials, more time. But the species dying from the blight did not have more time. Caroline put the device away and started walking again, faster now. The life signs on her scanner were large, but they were also weak. Something was wrong with whatever lived in those caves. Something was hurting them, and she had a terrible feeling that she knew what it was. The entrance to the cave appeared suddenly through the snow. One moment there was only white in every direction. The next, there was a massive dark opening in the side of the mountain, easily large enough for a starship to fly through. The rock around the entrance was carved with patterns that her translator could not read, but that clearly showed intelligence. Whatever lived here was not a simple animal. Caroline hesitated at the entrance. She was one small human. She had no weapons except for a utility knife. If the creatures inside decided she was a threat, she would have no way to defend herself. But she had not become a xenobiologist because she played it safe. And she had not spent 7 years chasing the blight because she was willing to watch from a distance. She stepped into the cave. The wind stopped immediately. The silence was so sudden that her ears rang with it. The tunnel ahead was dimly lit by some kind of bioluminescent moss that grew on the walls, casting everything in a soft blue glow. She followed the tunnel deeper into the mountain. The warmth surprised her. Not warmth like a summer day, but warmth compared to the killing cold outside. The temperature inside the cave was still far below freezing, but it was stable, controlled. This was not a natural cave. It was a home. The first dragon appeared without warning. One moment Caroline was alone in the tunnel. The next, a shape was materializing out of the shadows ahead of her. It was huge, at least 50 feet long from snout to tail. Its scales were deep blue and seemed to glow with their own inner light. Its eyes were the color of frozen stars, and they fixed on Caroline with an intensity that made her stop breathing. She had seen images of creatures like this in old Earth mythology, dragons. They were supposed to be legends, stories told to children. But there was nothing legendary about the creature standing in front of her. It was real. It was alive. And it was watching her with what might have been curiosity or hunger. She could not tell which. Caroline slowly raised her hands to show. She was not holding anything dangerous. The dragon did not move. It simply watched her, its breath creating small clouds of frost in the air. Then it spoke. The sound was unlike anything Caroline had ever heard. It was musical and harsh at the same time, full of harmonic layers that seemed to vibrate through her body. Her translator took a moment to process it. Then a calm voice spoke in her ear. What manner of creature walks into our grief? Caroline swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry. Her heart was pounding. But she kept her hands raised, and she kept her voice steady. My name is Caroline Walsh, she said. I am a healer, and I think I can help your children. The dragon tilted its massive head. Its eyes narrowed slightly. Behind it, Caroline could hear other sounds now. More movement in the darkness. More breathing. More of these creatures were approaching. "A healer," the dragon repeated. Its voice was deep and cold, like wind over ice. "Our healers have failed. Our medicines have failed. What can a small, soft thing like you do that the Valkyrie cannot?" Caroline lowered her hand slowly. She reached into her pack, moving carefully so the dragon would not think she was reaching for a weapon. Her fingers found the device she was looking for, and she pulled it out. "This," she said, holding it up. "I have been studying the sickness that is killing your children. I have seen it on other worlds, and I have spent years creating something that might stop it." "Might," the dragon said. "You are not certain." "No," Caroline admitted. "I am not certain. But I would rather try something uncertain than stand by and watch while children die." The dragon stared at her for a long moment. More shapes were appearing in the tunnel now, other dragons of various sizes, all watching this tiny stranger who had walked into their sacred place. Finally, the dragon stepped aside. "Come," it said. "Meet the matriarch. Let her judge whether your help is welcome." Caroline nodded and walked forward into the darkness, surrounded by creatures that could kill her with a single breath. She had never been more afraid in her life, but she had also never been more determined. The nesting cavern was the largest enclosed space Caroline had ever seen. The ceiling rose so high above her that it disappeared into darkness. The walls stretched so far in every direction that she felt like she was standing in a cathedral built for giants, which, she realized, was exactly what it was. Dragons filled the cavern. They lined the walls. They perched on ledges carved into the stone. They lay in clusters on the frozen floor. There were dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, and every single one of them was watching her dot at the center of the cavern, surrounded by a ring of glowing eggs. Stood the largest dragon Caroline had ever seen. Matriarch Selvora was magnificent and terrifying. Her scales were darker than the others, a blue so deep it was almost purple. Her wings, even folded against her body, seemed to fill the space around her. Her eyes held a weight of years that Caroline could only try to imagine, and those eyes were now fixed entirely on the small human walking toward her. "The Border Guardian tells me you claim to be a healer," Selvora said. Her voice was like the rumble of a distant avalanche. "He tells me you claim to know the sickness that is killing our young." Caroline stopped a respectful distance from the eggs. Up close, she could see how beautiful they were. Their crystalline shells caught the light and scattered it in rainbow patterns. But she could also see how dim the glow inside them had become. These eggs were dying. "I do know it," Caroline said. "My people call it the stellar blight. It travels through space on the same winds that carry light from star to star. It has destroyed ecosystems on 3 worlds that I have visited. It attacks the life essence of living things, especially the young and the unborn." A murmur ran through the assembled dragons. Some of them shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward with interest. "And you have a cure?" Selvora asked. "I have a treatment," Caroline said carefully. "A compound that I developed after years of research. It is not proven. The authorities of my people would not allow me to use it widely because they said it needed more testing. But I believe it works. I have seen small-scale results that give me hope." "Hope," said a deep voice from behind her. Caroline turned to see the male dragon who had met her at the entrance. He stood beside an even larger male, one whose scales were scarred from old battles. "Our hopes have been dying with our eggs for months. Why should we trust the hopes of a stranger?" "Because I have nothing to gain by lying to you," Caroline said simply. "I did not know you existed until an hour ago. I came to this planet following a distress signal from a machine, not looking for your people. I have no reason to trick you or hurt you. I am simply a scientist who has spent years fighting a disease that I hate with all my heart. Salvora studied her for a long moment. Why do you hate it so much? Caroline was quiet for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. I had a partner, she said. His name was Henry Vasquez. He was the kindest man I ever knew. We worked together on the research for this treatment. We traveled to dying worlds together. We collected samples together. We spent late nights in the laboratory together, trying to find an answer. She paused and took a breath. On a world called Tyrannosaur, there was a species of small creatures. Gentle things. They cared for their young in family groups, much like your pack. The blight was killing their babies. Henry could not stand to just observe. He went into the infected area without proper protection, trying to save the young ones that were still alive. The cavern was completely silent now. Even the dragons who had been hostile seemed to be listening. He saved 11 of them, Caroline continued. Carried them out one by one. But the exposure was too much. The blight entered his system. By the time I reached him, it was too late. He died 3 days later. She looked up at Salvora, and there were tears in her eyes that she did not try to hide. I finished our research because he could not. I created this treatment because he believed it was possible. And I carry it with me everywhere I go, because I swore on his memory that I would use it to save lives whenever I had the chance. Salvora lowered her great head until one eye was level with Caroline. This close, Caroline could see the depth of age in that eye and the depth of pain. You understand loss, the matriarch said quietly. I can see it in you. Smell it on your grief. Yes, Caroline whispered. I understand loss. Another dragon stepped forward. It was the old female with faded scales. The one Caroline would later learn was called Verthini. She moved slowly, carefully, and her voice was gentle. If your treatment fails, she said, what then? What if it makes our hatchlings worse? What if it kills them faster? Then I will accept whatever punishment your people decide is appropriate, Caroline said, without hesitation. You can freeze me. You can eat me. You can do whatever justice requires. I will not run. I will not fight. You would die for our children? Verthini asked, genuine surprise in her voice. You do not even know us. Caroline looked around the cavern, at all the massive creatures watching her, at all the dying eggs glowing dimly in their nests, at all the grief written on faces that were so different from human faces, yet somehow expressed the same emotions. I became a healer to save lives, she said. Not human lives specifically. All lives. Every life is precious. Every child deserves a chance to grow and learn and become whatever it was meant to become. Your children are not my children, but they are still children. And I will not stand by and watch them die when there is something I might be able to do. Silence fell over the cavern again. Salvora raised her head and looked at her mate Kethoran. He had been quiet throughout the conversation, watching and listening. Now he nodded slowly. Salvora turned back to Caroline. Very well, human healer, she said. Show us what your kind can do. But know this, if you fail, you will not leave this cavern alive. Not because we are cruel, but because we cannot allow word of our weakness to spread. We are the last of our kind on this continent. If others knew how vulnerable we have become, they might come to finish what the plague started. Caroline nodded. I understand. Then begin. Caroline walked toward the eggs, already pulling equipment from her pack. Around her, 47 dragons watched in silence. Some with hope, some with suspicion, all with desperation. The fate of an entire species now rested in her small, fragile hands. She only hoped they would be strong enough. 6 months had passed since the Night of Miracles. The frozen world of Karath 7 had not changed. The snow still fell without stopping. The ice still covered everything. The wind still howled across the endless white expanses. But something was different now. Something had shifted in the eternal winter. The dragons were singing again. Not mourning songs. Not the terrible laments that had echoed across the continent when the blight was killing their young. These were different songs. Songs of joy. Songs of hope. Songs that told a story the Volturi had never expected to tell. The story of the small creature who walked out of the storm. Caroline stood at the mouth of the great nesting cavern, wrapped in furs that the dragons had helped her make from the pelts of the massive snow beasts that roamed the glaciers. The furs were warm enough to let her survive outside her thermal suit, and she had grown used to the weight of them on her shoulders. She had grown used to many things in 6 months. Behind her, in the warmth of the cavern, 11 young dragons were causing trouble. They had grown fast, as dragon children do. Their scales had darkened from newborn pale to brilliant blue. Their wings had unfolded and strengthened. Their frostfire breath was developing nicely, much to the annoyance of the adults, who kept having to thaw frozen water supplies. But they were healthy. They were strong. They were alive, and they were not the only ones. The treatment had worked beyond anything Caroline had dared to hope. After saving the eggs in Salvora's clutch, she had shared the compound with Verthini and taught the old healer how to create more using materials found on the planet itself. Together, they had sent messengers to other packs across the continent, carrying the cure to every nesting ground that was still suffering. Not everyone could be saved. The blight had claimed many victims before the treatment arrived, but hundreds of eggs that would have died were now healthy. Hundreds of hatchlings who would never have been born were now learning to fly and hunt and sing. The Volturi would survive. Their species would continue. Their songs would echo across this frozen world for another 10,000 generations, all because one small human had refused to give. Up. Caroline heard the heavy footsteps behind her and smiled without turning around. She knew that sound by now. She knew many dragon sounds by now. "The hatchlings are asking for you again," Salvora said, her great body settling onto the stone beside the entrance. "They want you to watch them practice their flying." "They practiced their flying yesterday," Caroline replied, "and the day before that, and every day for the past month. They are proud of their progress. They want to impress you." Caroline finally turned to look at the matriarch. In 6 months, she had come to know this ancient creature well. Salvora was wise and fierce and endlessly patient with the young ones. She was also, Caroline had discovered, surprisingly funny when she wanted to be. Why would they want to impress me? Caroline asked. "I cannot fly. I can barely walk through deep snow without falling over." Salvora made a sound that might have been a laugh. "They do not understand what you are," she said. "They have never seen a creature so small before. Some of them think you are a very strange dragon. A dragon who somehow forgot how to fly and breathe frost and grow scales. And what do you tell them?" Salvora was quiet for a moment, her ancient eyes gazing out at the endless white landscape. "I tell them the truth," she said finally. "I tell them that you are something rarer than a dragon. Something more precious. I tell them that you are a human, a creature from beyond the sky, from a world so warm that snow never falls. That must seem very strange to them. It does. It does. They cannot imagine such a place." Salvora turned her head to look at Caroline directly. "But I also tell them that you are the one who saved them. That when their people were dying and their elders had lost hope, a stranger appeared in the storm and chose to fight for them. I tell them that you risked your life for children who were not your own, for a species you had never met, for a world you had no reason to care about." Caroline felt her eyes grow wet. Even after 6 months, The weight of what had happened still caught her off guard sometimes. Henry would have done the same thing, she said softly. He always said that the best thing about humanity was not our technology or our ships or our great cities. It was that we could not stop ourselves from caring about things that had nothing to do with us. He said that our empathy was our greatest gift. Then your Henry was wise, Selvora said. And I am sorry I will never meet him. So am I. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snowfall and the aurora dance across the sky. In the distance, Caroline could hear the young dragons playing, their high cries mixing with the deeper calls of the adults watching over them. What will you do now? Selvora asked eventually. Your ship is repaired. You could leave. Return to your people. Tell them what you found here. Caroline had thought about this many times over the past months. She had contacted her research institution and sent them all the data about the treatment. She had filed reports with the Galactic Medical Council, providing proof that her compound worked. She had done everything that her duties as a scientist required, but she had not left. I sent a message to the council last week, she said. I told them I was taking an extended leave of absence. I said I had found something worth staying for. Selvora tilted her great head. And what did you find? A family, Caroline said simply. I found a family. Before Selvora could respond, a commotion erupted behind them. Young voices were calling out, and the heavy sound of running feet was getting closer. Caroline, watch this. Watch what we can do. 3 young dragons burst out of the cavern and launched themselves into the air. Their wings beat clumsily at first, but then they found their rhythm and began to soar. They rose higher and higher, circling above the 2 figures at the cave entrance, crying out with joy at their own accomplishment. One of them, a male named Korath, who had been the first to hatch that terrible night, dipped down close enough that his wingtip almost brushed Caroline's head. Did you see? Did you see how high I went? Caroline laughed and waved at him. I saw. You are getting very good. The hatchlings soared away again, chasing each other across the sky, playing games that dragon children had played for thousands of generations. Selvora watched them go with something that looked very much like a smile. They love you, she said. All of them. The young ones and the old ones. You are part of this pack now, Caroline Walsh. You will always have a home here, for as long as you want it. Thank you, Caroline whispered. That means more than I can say. There is one more thing. Selvora rose to her full height and spread her magnificent wings. We have composed a new song. A song about you. It will be taught to every hatchling in every pack across this world. It will be sung for as long as the Velthari exist. A song about me? Yes. Would you like to hear it? Caroline nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Selvora raised her head to the sky and began to sing. The melody was unlike anything Caroline had heard before. It was not mournful or joyful or triumphant. It was all of those things and none of them. It was simply beautiful. A pattern of sounds that seemed to capture everything that had happened over the past 6 months. Everything that had been lost and everything that had been saved. Other voices joined in. Dragons emerged from the cavern, adding their harmonies. The young ones in the sky stopped their playing and added their own thin cries to the chorus. And Caroline Walsh, the small strange creature who had walked out of a blizzard and saved a species, stood in the snow and listened to the song that would carry her name into eternity. The song had a title, Selvora had told her. The translation was rough, because dragon concepts did not always fit neatly into human words, but roughly translated. It meant friend, and as the song echoed across the frozen landscape, joining with other songs from other packs until the whole continent seemed to be singing, Caroline thought about Henry and about home and about the strange paths that life sometimes took she had come to. This world looking for a broken machine. She had found something far more precious. She had found where she belonged. The end.